Okay, so first of all, thank you for joining us. I hope you've been able to read the introduction in chapter 1. If you haven't, you can go backwards. It amounts to about 35 pages. So I want to keep us at a slow pace to make sure we can really get our heads around what Delores Williams is doing in the book. And she lays that out really well in the introduction, introducing things like, what is a womanist, right? What are the challenges of womanism? And how is it that particularly Black women, whether they're African-American or Afro-Caribbean or other miscellaneous titles, how is it that the scriptural stories resonate with them? And where does that resonance lead them in faith, if that makes sense? Sometimes we can say, I think, well, since I'm not a Black woman, then the story doesn't need to resonate with me because this just isn't my experience. But I hope by the end of the book, actually, this will expand the way the story resonates with you, whether we're talking about Hagar or, as we're going to do in part 2, Jesus and the cross, so that these stories can not just be things that happened long ago, but that the way that the stories play out in our lives and play out in our faith can widen. What Julia asked me to do, because we talk about names just a little bit in the book, right? Particularly about how Hagar names God, and that happens in chapter 1. She asked if I would be willing to just go over names really, really briefly for God in the Bible. And we've done this before, but maybe it bears repeating because we're going to talk about names. So I've got this small document. I'm happy to email it to you if you want. It's not particularly insightful. It's just a good descriptor. You'll see in the first 1, 2, 3, 4 titles that the root of the title is the word El, like Elohim, El Roy, El Shaddai, and El Elyon, right? And the book talks about how El was the chief deity in the Canaanite pantheon. That doesn't mean El was the most worshipped deity. El was just sort of considered like the king of the gods. And in a polytheistic culture, people might have given their devotion to one or multiple gods at the same time. And what seems to be the case in Canaan, particularly, is that Baal was given maybe more devotion than El. And this would be similar, if you know anything about Hinduism, to the chief god of the Hindu pantheon is Brahma, like the bull. And very few people give loving devotion to Brahma. They tend to accentuate Shiva or Krishna. Brahma is like the creator god, and then Brahma like kind of steps back. And so that's maybe a little bit similar to El. And some of these names, it's hard to say, are the people in Genesis, are they saying, well, El is the chief of the pantheon and El is like the god? So probably that's how it evolved, is that they focused devotion on El as the top of the pantheon, and then El became the only god. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying. And some of that evolution plays out in the Bible. So there's a few of these, like Melchizedek calls God El Elyon, and that's God Most High. Abraham calls God El Shaddai, and that means the God of hosts, where a host is a military unit that has 1,000 soldiers in it. And Hagar, of course, calls God El Roy. And that means, as the author talked about, God who sees. Elohim, reminder, ends up, and it's a plural form. This is a Hebrew plural, is the name used for God in the northern tribes. And it's probably shows up in our Bible quite a bit. This is usually translated as just God in the Hebrew Bible. There's a dissertation from one of my former professors about this, that this is probably the personal name for God in the north. And after the north gets wiped out, the south uses the word Elohim because they've considered their name for God, the Y word, to be so holy that you don't write it or intone it. And so since these people are gone, they use their personal name so they don't have to use their own. And by the way, that kind of continues to today. Our Jewish brothers and sisters they have no problem saying the word Elohim. It's not disrespectful at all. On the other hand, our Jewish and brothers and sisters still today would never say the Y name, or if they would, it would be exceedingly rare, because the Y name for God is not written nor said. Instead, reminder that our Jewish brothers and sisters either say Hashem, or we use the word the tetragrammaton, which is the 4 letters, and those 4 letters in English are YHWH. Reminder, this is such a big deal that in the synagogue, people don't touch the Torah scroll with their own hand, because they perceive that would defile the scroll and defile them. They use a pointer with a hand like this called a yad. And the people who copy the Torah scroll and write God's name, they have to do purification for having done that. The scrolls, when they're retired to this day, they either get buried or they get cremated. They get treated like a human, not like an object. And it's because God's name is written on them. The other words that get used in the Hebrew Bible for God are the words Adonai, which means Lord. And we hear it a lot. You can hear it in contemporary praise music, songs about Adonai, but it just means Lord, like a duke is an Adonai, or a plantation owner. And then you're probably familiar with the word Baal. Baal is a god in the Babylonian pantheon, but Baal just also means Lord in Hebrew. Sometimes it's pronounced Baal. So you can choose whether you're pronouncing Hebrew or Aramaic, and that'll change whether it's Baal or Baal. So those are our names for God. And what the author names that's really quite interesting is that Hagar is the only woman to give God a name. Naming is really significant, because naming implies a power relationship. So just consider that you name your children, but they don't name you. You may say, oh, my kids call me mommy, or like mamacita, or whatever they call you, but that's not your name, that's your position. So if you buy this, there's always an unequal power relationship between parents and children, because parents name their kids and kids don't name their parents. In the ancient Near East, if you knew a god's name, in all the stories, right, people find out the god's name through trickery. Like they trick it out of the gods, because when you got a god's name, you can obligate them to show up by saying their name. So names have this power to conjure the presence of a deity. And we don't necessarily believe that anymore. Well, we kind of do, though. If you go to an evangelical church, you'll notice that every third word in a prayer is Jesus. Lord Jesus, we ask you, Jesus, hear us, Jesus, heal us, Jesus. So we use that name as a punctuation because it's obligating God. That's, by the way, why our Jewish brothers and sisters avoid using God's holy name, right? Because God will show up. It's just that God is holier than you, and that could be bad. I don't know if that makes sense. So all that's going on in the background, and here is Hagar giving God a name, and of course the name refers to her experience, and it is what the author calls not totally a salvation experience, right? It's interesting to hear that Delores Williams parses out the difference between liberation and survival. And that liberation might be the hope, but the story is really about survival. And this, she says, right, is the womanist experience, hoping for liberation, whereas God is involved day to day in survival. Okay, so that was the naming bit, and I hope that was helpful for you all. And I'm not going to ask an awful question. I want to ask you, what was new or what was meaningful in the introduction of the chapters before we talk about questions. What either grabbed your attention? What did you learn? How did chapter 1 in the introduction widen your vision of this story?
Well, I'll hop right in. I think I've got a couple questions, actually.
Okay.
The experience that we're going to be reading about seems to me to be an American experience and Caribbean experience. It doesn't seem to apply to slaves that the Africans themselves had in Africa, or the slavery that other peoples have had, or slavery that the Arabs now practice. Because and it seems to me that it's entirely an American, the Christian experience. Is that true?
I want to say yes and no at the same time. I think what, and obviously the author is a Black woman, and she's also going to be careful not to speak for all Black women, although I think she is going to say, in general, through her research and her own story, that this is an anchor experience. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this story is probably applicable to ethnically diverse slaves in any country, especially for women.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think the author believes that this story would apply to African slaves in Africa or to Slavic slaves in the former Muslim empire. And of course, that's where the word slave comes from anyway, right? They're Slavs who are sort of bondsmen and women in the former Muslim empire.
But they wouldn't have the Hagar story to fall back on.
I think they may have not been familiar with that story, but I think the author would suggest that their experience probably resonates with the story in these same ways.
You know, there are different kinds of slavery throughout the West Europe and Asia and the Eastern European countries and things of that sort. And some of them, like we Americans, had a brutal form of slavery, whereas in Italy and some of those European countries, people sometimes put themselves into slavery because they were treated with respect, but they had a support, and then they, you know, a lot of them became doctors and all kinds of things. Some of them were considered to, in some families, were considered to be, in some countries, members of the family, whereas you go to some of these other countries where it was cruel. I don't know that any nation treated their Black people any worse than our American ancestors did, you know, because the more I read and learn about this, the more horrified I am at what has happened to those people, you know. But I was able to read to almost 2/3 of the chapter. I started with the preface and moved on back. And the one thing that really struck me was why these women are so spiritual is that, and on introduction on page 5, it says they believe God is involved not only in their survival struggle, but that God also supports their struggle for quality of life, which Making a Way suggests. In other words, it seems to me that, you know, for us white Anglo descendants, you know, God has been more intellectual here, whereas it looks like to me that these African American women they've got a personal relationship with God. In other words, God is not just a thought. God is something that lives in them, supports them, makes a way out of no way. And it's a very personal kind of relationship, which has helped them survive.
Thank you. Darlene, I think I saw you were ready. Yeah.
Yes, a couple of comments. One on Meg's observation about the personal contact with God and their daily life. To me, that resonates with the more African nature, awareness of God in nature. And so to me, that's an African influence on how they see God, as well as the Hagar story of what was that phrase? Going with them continually. So I see a double influence there, the African as well as the Hagar story. Go back to your original question of something new that came to me. The parallel between Hagar's naming God, the parallel between that and the Egyptian myth associated with the god Ra. Am I saying Ra right?
You are. Some people say Ray
Okay,
or
Ray.
Ra.
Okay.
But most people say Ra.
Okay. The parallel with the eyes influencing her naming of God. That makes me kind of wonder about, I know a lot of the stories that we have in the Bible are, there are parallel stories with myths. And it makes me wonder about the influence of myths on the people of this time as they attempted to interpret their experience with the God that we have named, or the God that we think we know through the scripture. It may not be, I guess it's not really necessary to ferret that out, but I just find it really interesting.
Thank you. I think if you don't know this term, I've showed it to you before, and she uses it. The word is syncretism, and it's spelled just like when your voices get in sync with one another. Syncretism is when one culture encounters another culture and finds a rite, a ritual, a theology, even a word so helpful in expanding their own thinking that they adopt it. So let me give you a real easy example of syncretism, the word pajamas. That's a Hindu word, like it's a Hindi word, and it's very descriptive for us. Another word that we use is the word karma, and most people would say what goes around comes around. Karma is not a one-to-one for us because most Westerners don't believe in the transmigration of souls and reincarnation. So if you're a Hindu, broadly speaking, you believe that what goes around comes around, but it may take several lifetimes before it does. So if you ever wonder, why do bad things happen to good people? It's because they earned it in a different lifetime. We don't hold on to the different lifetime stuff. So our syncretism is not one-to-one, if that makes sense. And this like semi-syncretism is probably one of those things going on in the name that we've used for God, right? The word El was a god in the Canaanite pantheon, and the same also in Mesopotamia. El was known around other places. And ultimately, that means something different in Hebrew because it wasn't a one-to-one syncretism. we found Muslim people using beads. We put a cross on them, change the number of beads, and we call it a rosary. But that's syncretism.
Yeah.
The Ra story, for what it's worth, is really interesting, because if you know, Ra has a son who's a falcon, and Ra's son is called Horus. But Horus is also Ra's eye. This is really strange. We don't really know that much about Egyptian religion. I know you learned something about it in the 2nd grade in gifted and talented schools. Most of that's probably not right. Apparently, according to my professor from Johns Hopkins. But what we do know is that Ra's son, Horus, is Ra's eye. And sometimes it's Ra's eye, and sometimes it's Horus the falcon. And this whole bit about Ra's seeing and this Egyptianism that has made it not one-to-one into the Hebrew language, right? I'd forgotten about that. That was a treat. I mean, that was so interesting. And to hear the author say, this is possibly Hagar actively resisting patriarchal theology. And it got put in the narrative, which most assuredly was written by a man and edited by men. So it's really interesting that this bit of patriarchal resistance made it into our Bible.
I want to suggest that perhaps the man didn't recognize that.
Absolutely.
The man that put it into the story had no idea what Hagar was doing.
It's really possible. And I want to also hold out, there is the potential, and this is why I love using the word inspiration. Maybe they did know.
Oh, okay.
Because this is where I love to use the phrase that evangelicals use, but in a different way. God works in mysterious ways.
Okay.
So you'll find writers, particularly feminist, womanist, and Latinx writers, who will say sometimes let me think what the word is. The text is arguing with itself. There are these little pushback stories that actually allow you to turn the hinge on the whole story if you choose. They're called subversive readings because they can subvert the whole story if you let them.
Yeah. Can easily do this with the Hagar story, because so much emphasis has been placed on her owners, Abraham and Sarah, and we've taken it one direction, and now here, this is another, doing the Hagar story is a totally different, well, it's not different, but it's a different, it's a different pathway, I guess you would say. And you certainly look at Abraham and Sarah a little bit different now. Abraham and Sarai a little different now.
Yeah, thank you. You know, what's interesting is the author reminds us too, is that the Apostle Paul in his letters uses this story as a type scene. That is, he doesn't speak to the historical reality. He says there's like types of people, and some types are like the slave woman thrown out, which is kind of like making a socially unjust joke. And I think that ratchets this up. So for what it's worth, you'll notice at St. Thomas, when we pray Eucharistic prayer C, I do actually change the language of that prayer in the bulletin. Instead of Lord God of our fathers, it's Lord God of our parents, Hagar, Sarah, and Keturah.
I love how you do that. I appreciate how you do that. Every time I see you change, it's like, yes, he hears me.
Well, that's biblical theology, right? What's interesting about this story, again, is that it's subversive. You don't hear this in Sunday school, that Abraham was like passive aggressively abusing a lady and actively aggressively abusing a lady. Look, you don't hear that story. And that God's promise in maybe unexpected ways was also to this woman and her offspring. What else was new for you all? Lila, welcome. Glad you're here.
Yeah.
We're talking about the experience for African American women. And I know this may be off the subject a bit, do African American males view Christianity in the same way?
So same is tough. And you know, what I always love to do, and our brain has evolved to do this, is have simple categories that we can fit as many people as we can in, right? We don't like to hold a lot of tension. So the answer is some of this, yes, and others of it, no. And if you're really interested, and we can talk if we want to continue doing this sort of work together when we get through with this book, we can read the more definitive Black male perspective. It's called God of the Oppressed. It's written by James Cone. And Delores Williams references James Cone. Ellen, I see you're maybe ready. Yeah.
One thing I had not thought about until I read this was the inheritance issue. I just was looking at the personal and interpersonal relationships and all that, but it made a huge difference how it was handled as far as the firstborn inheriting. That was new to me.
And I tried to accentuate this back in Lent, but it's not just that Sarah doesn't want Ishmael to get the double portion. She doesn't want him to get anything, like nothing, which is, it's important to point out, like that's against, there's no like law, that's against the culture. I mean, even the kids of concubines get something.
And it's not only her interest in his getting the inheritance, but that leads to her sustenance later on. That if he gets the stuff, the good stuff, then he is more able to take care of her.
Hmm.
So there's some self-interest in this too.
Yeah. I think that, forgive me for saying this, I don't want to be preachy, but I find this very relevant because sometimes when we talk about social justice, there's this fear that there's not enough to share. So we have to hold everything we can. Most people wouldn't see it that way, but just because the way you mentioned it, Ellen, like when you talk about things like, when we culturally talk about ideas like affirmative action, the response is, we don't want that taken from us. We've been taking for millennia. You know, like it's interesting that we don't have that recognition and we have that hoarding response. And that's where I think this is a really interesting story for talking about things like, white fragility and greed. We just think it'd be the worst thing in the world if a white person was discriminated against because, you know, people were chosen because of their race. But hello, like that's what we've been doing in this country for 300 plus years. Well, it's not right, and that's why it shouldn't happen. Well, okay, but let's own we've been doing that.
It's interesting that you were talking about them fighting over the piece of pie. When I worked in upstate New York, the college I was working at hosted a conference for Native Americans. And one of the issues was they weren't getting their fair share because it was all going to African Americans. And there was a clash between the two cultures.
Yeah. I still hear people who say that, and it's so statistically incorrect. But you know, we all choose what to believe, and I'm going to include myself. I like to think I'm a linear, thoughtful guy, but we're not all linear. I've got like certain opinions that are nonsense, but I really believe them. I want to raise up that I thought it was very interesting to me, this hypothesis, and she calls it that, right? She doesn't say it has to be like this. She says there's a way of reading this that says, hey, maybe Sarah was actually protecting the virginity of Hagar. And then Sarah took that away, and Hagar felt like betrayed by her protector. That was a very interesting read to me. It wasn't one that naturally occurred to me when I read the story. I also thought it was interesting that God sends Hagar back the first time in order to ensure her survival. And this is one of those tough things. And I think sometimes like I get real extreme in the position. Like I want to say like, well, no woman should ever have to be a prostitute. And while that's true, women have to survive. And sometimes that's the only way to survive. So like I have this luxury as a white empowered male in saying that I don't want my daughter ever doing that. Well, and I don't. And I think that's okay to say, but really I don't want my daughter to ever have to do that. Is probably the better word. Instead of thinking of it as a choice, it's a survival requirement. And to hear that like God gets survival requirements and that dying in the desert on a principle is a luxury. And of course we all get, right, if Hagar dies, so does the baby. And this is often women's plight. And in this case, it's very, very descriptive. Women often don't have the luxury of just walking out of an abusive relationship because what will happen to the kid? And in this sense, I thought this was very embodied read of the story, and it resonates with all kinds of women, white, Black, Latinx, Native American. Darlene, please.
This translates practically into how I work with women who are being abused. I never advocate that they just leave. I advocate, let's work through a survival plan for you to keep you safe in this abusive relationship until we develop survival skills, survival outlets, how to get a job, how to hold a job, where are you going to go, what clothes do you take with you when you leave. It involves survival, development of survival techniques before she escapes. So it was a very practical thing that God did.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mother was a battered woman, and she hung in there for a while until one night my dad tried to kill us all. That's when she left him. But she stayed with him because we were in a remote area, and she had no place to go. But finally she got in touch with her mother, and then we went and stayed with them. And but today, I feel for those women who are killed before they can get out. I don't know, I don't know. I don't understand what happens to men that they become so cruel. But my father was an SOB par excellence, but they have no self-respect, no self-esteem. They don't love themselves, and they can't love anybody else. I guess what it is. But anyway, women have been battered all through the centuries, and but that's what I like about the Black women here and their relationship with God. They really hold on to God during that time, and I just feel so sorry for the modern day woman who doesn't know God but is in that kind of a situation.
Thank you. And you quoted that line in the introduction that was really interesting. And I noticed there were two, like another little 4 words, right? That it's a struggle to survive and have a productive quality of life in the face of death.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to hear that this story is very descriptive. And at the same time, as we continue to read through the book, and this is not a new idea for you all, but this story sadly has been used prescriptively
Mhm.
to say women can be treated like surrogates.
Yeah.
And look, Hagar went back, you should go back.
Yeah,
And
but that was Hagar taking care of herself too, and the baby, because she couldn't.
yeah, but you know, like, and I went to seminary, and I was appalled to hear this, but apparently people still say it, right? Where women will go to their pastor, having been abused verbally, physically, emotionally, and the pastor will say, it's your Christian duty to go back to try to convert your husband, instead of saying, you need a survival plan and we will make one for you. And you don't have to take it, but we hope you will. And it's one way of resonating with the text, saying, this happened in the text, it should happen again. And another way of saying, survival is really, really important. So if somebody comes to me, I don't want to just say, you ought to leave that bastard. Like, I need to be able to make that actually possible, or my words, frankly, are just oppressive. Telling people what they ought to do without lifting a finger to help them with their burden, that's what Jesus critiques the Pharisees on.
Well, in conjunction with that, it's very, I'm sure you get it from Roman Catholic priests too, but one of the things that I've come across recently is how the evangelistic churches, how the heads of them have gotten together, and they have really laid out more of a male-centered understanding of the scriptures. In other words, they're interpreted as really being supportive of males.
Yeah.
And that's why, I know, and people, women who have gone to their pastor and they said, well, you have to go back. They don't have to go back, but it's that erroneous teaching then that is causing so much pain.
If we don't do anything to create a means of survival, they probably do have to go back. That's the hard bit.
That's right. Yeah. And then these days, they're easily killed because there's more guns in America than there are Americans.
Yeah.
Well, I think as far as the evangelicals are concerned, I think, now this is simply my own thought, but they are a for-profit church.
That's true. Yeah.
The
Catholic Church is too, but anyway,
yes.
Roman Church.
So if they're a for-profit church, like say with Joel Osteen, they want to maintain their male dominance because that's where they get their power from.
And their money. Yeah.
And money.
Yeah, I want to play the other side of the card and say, I think that in my experience, the people who are doing that are actually really well-intentioned.
They're misled and well-intentioned, yes.
Lila, did anything you would like to share about the introduction or chapter 1? Things that you learned, or like, oh, I don't know.
So this was all great news to me, actually. And I so want to learn more about my brothers and sisters of color right now. And I want to learn how to respect them better. And I was amazed that she wrote this in 1993? Oh my goodness. And that, looking back, that looks like the dark ages compared to now. So I'm sure for Black women it wasn't. I know from other quick reading in history, I'm thinking of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's the story of the woman who, the cell line for all this cancer research is based on her cells. And she was treated very badly by everybody. I mean, not just the medical profession, but her entire family. The Black culture at that time was just so abusive of women.
Mhm.
And man, if you were born a Black woman, you were the bottom of the heap. And when she was raped by her cousins, that was like, as a child, common. It was common. So I have to admit, I mean, I had very little appreciation for this theology of survival that she's talking about. And I have an increasing appreciation for the role of the Black church in the Black community.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I continue to be amazed at what men get away with. And there's some kind of testosterone poisoning. I mean, that I say that a little tongue in cheek, but
Mm.
you know, if an alien came to Earth and just looked statistically at violence, crime, and picked out the group statistically that was overwhelmingly the instigators of these crimes, it's by far it's men. And I don't know, I don't think that's been addressed very well. I think there's two sides of this coin, and it is gender related and it is race related, and this is such an incredibly rich book. I'm amazed and fascinated. You know, this saying, boys will be boys, which has become extremely unpopular, I think is an admission that culturally we know we are not preparing our boys for manhood. We know we're not doing it as a culture, as a tribe, if you will. And there are tribes, more quote primitive tribes, that will kick a male adolescent out of camp unless he does some kind of vision quest type of deal where he goes out into nature and kills a lion. Or, I mean, these are rites of passage, right? Where he has to confront his own mortality so that he comes back with respect for other people. I mean, women don't need that. And I guess I'm a little bit hungry to explore those ideas in this book, and I see her doing it. And I think our adolescent males and young men have a very tough time in our culture being able to mature. And I was quite struck by this lady and the work she had done to sort this through and be able to explain it in a way that I, as a short white woman, feel I can understand it on some level. So I'm just very hungry for that. I'm very much.
Thank you. I don't know if it's worth me telling you that the seminary I went to had a program called Black Church Studies, and I did not do a certificate in Black Church Studies, but we were required to take a preaching class, and I took Black preaching instead of white preaching. And so that was one of several encounters I had with the Black Church Studies program. And it is interesting to hear that even though the church is very, very central, the Black church, I'm going to make a generalization, is extremely patriarchal. even though Black women do like 95% of the work. So it's matriarchically organized, but the patriarchy is really strong in the Black church. And that's like this, you wouldn't think it would be that way. And it is very much the case. And being able, and like from my viewpoint, it's like, well, geez, if women would just all get together, they could say no, and then it would work. And again, like that this book is a reminder that is a luxury, that you have to have your basic needs of food and shelter met before you can start doing these psychological and spiritual needs. And because those things are in question, it's really, really tough. And I think we're moving, and we haven't figured this out socially, to like what rites of passage there ought to be. And I will tell you that I think whatever your experience is, like, I don't want to use the word primitive, but in other cultures, a girl becomes a woman when she has a baby. That's a rite of passage. And I think what we're getting, right, what we've got to figure out is, hey, some women choose not to, some women can't. And so womanhood cannot be contingent upon that. And men, the rite of passage is really, really hard. I think particularly in socially depressed areas, boys become men when they're tried as an adult, because see, then the court is acknowledging they're an adult. When they go to jail is sometimes a rite of passage. It shouldn't be, but it's the case. Or when they hit big time with a sports career. Used to be, for folks in America, you were an adult when you graduated high school. But that's not a rite of passage anymore. Well, maybe it's college. I don't think so. Maybe it's when you get a master's degree. We don't really have a clear rite. It's interesting that high school sports teams, they have like girls basketball, and now they'll say men's basketball. I'm sorry, high schoolers are not men. I don't care. And we want to, like, high schoolers want to be called men, and they want to take that name. And we don't know how to get them there. We don't have that rite of passage. And I think you're speaking, Lila, the other thing you mentioned about the okayness of this. And I'm going to tell you, there must be something wrong with me, because I hear other men, like the way they talk, and I'm like, boy, since I don't talk or think like that, I want to say, what's the matter with you? but I'm in the minority. Like, I just it blows my mind. And
Mike, you're super evolved.
I've still got a long way to go. It's really important to hear. And I'll tell you, it's not testosterone, because I've got healthy levels. In fact, when they weren't, I took more, and that didn't change my attitudes on this at all, and I'm totally cisgender. Like, I don't in any way not identify with my male body. I don't. So it's perplexing. And I think, one of the things that people like Delores Williams is going to say is part of the reason we get there culturally, it hinges on the way we read this story. Men can do this. Abraham is more passive, but he by passively allowing Sarah to do things that are wrong, he's consenting to them. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. And we can say, oh, well, back then it wasn't wrong. That was their culture. I mean, that's fine to say, except that still happens now. And in our culture, we know it's wrong, and we still do it. And we do it a couple of ways. Like you said, boys will be boys. Well, I think immature people will be immature, but I'm not convinced that socially we should encourage or allow or explain that away. I think we can say immature people will be immature, and it's our job socially to confront immaturity and empower change. Darlene, please.
I'm wondering if perhaps the difference in you and other males who are more highly evolved, as Lila mentioned, is perhaps a connection to having gone through a vision quest of your own or their own, where
Hmm.
having gone into the wilderness, not necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily the actual wilderness, but the wilderness of trauma or the wilderness of searching for something higher, has allowed that evolution to a higher level of thinking and feeling and spirituality. So I think there's a connection here. Wilderness, vision quest, male, female roles. There's lots of questions, and I love the questions and the searching.
Yeah, I think, and I do think part of it is I happen to love somebody deeply. I mean, I've chosen to love somebody deeply and yoke my life with hers, for whom this is not just something we have to put up with. We're going to talk about it. And I've chosen to believe her, even though I had to take a leap of faith to do that, because that wasn't my masculine experience, to believe her feminine experience. And I've said this before, according to the Pew study, the single most determinative factor on how members of Congress vote on women's rights legislation is not their party. It's whether or not they have daughters. And that makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I will say at the same time, I'm related to people who have daughters who are extremely patriarchal. And I don't think they do it just to be dominating, although it is dominating. So trying to play that out is really, 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 really tough.
And another thing, Mike, is, we have wonderful access to St. Augustine's in Galveston with Mike Brady being there.
Mhm.
And Terry Frank and I have attended a couple of times before the pandemic down there.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful step in that direction. Yeah. They're kind of Episcopals, they're kind of black. I mean, it's something to consider.
They also have a white man priest.
I know, but it's a wonderful historic church.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Were there any questions that you wish you could ask Delores Williams based on intro and chapter 1? Or are there things that you're hoping will be addressed as we continue to read? Roxella, please.
I'm not sure if this is a question, but how to state this. As being raised in the Hispanic culture and as a Hispanic woman, I identify to some extent in a culture that's not a Black woman's culture. It's also not a white woman's culture.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of women that fall in that for different reasons.
Yeah.
So it was quite thought-provoking. But I'm not sure I have been able to condense it or be able to say this is how I felt about this. But I did have a lot of different thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if this is of interest as we play out, I put in the chat, there is a great book by Ada Maria Asasi Diaz called A Mujerista Theology.
Oh.
And Delores also includes, has also identified those 3 sections of women. I found this book I'm really glad we're reading it. It's so informative. I mean, so I'm looking forward to the chapters that are coming.
Thank you. maybe I could ask you another question, and feel free to say whatever you'd like. But another question to say is, what do you wish people in the parish, people in the church with a capital C, what do you wish they knew that you've learned from the introduction in chapter 1?
I wish more women would participate in this study.
More women in terms of quantity, not percentage, right?
Yeah, quantity. Yeah, right.
I wish more men would participate in this.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, it would be good, you know, but anyway, because we have a big problem in this country, and we're going to, anyway, never mind.
The thing that has struck me about just what we've read so far, and I look back upon my career, it helps me to understand some things that have happened in the past with African American women.
I think I would like for people to recognize that there's a big difference between the African American woman's experience and our Anglo-white waspish experience. Although I also wonder, I saw a real good example yesterday of this patriarchal power. Was walking in out of a store, and there was a Black couple in front of me, and he was saying, "You're wrong. I can do any blankety blank thing I want to do." And she just cowered. But it also makes me wonder, we see that and kind of expect it in the Black community, but it happens in ours all the time.
Happens yeah.
And I don't think it's addressed nearly as much. So, I mean, that's just some of the things that are coming into my mind as I'm reading this.
Yeah, thank you. I think the difference between survival and liberation is a really interesting pulse point, and to think through who gets to affect liberation and who gets to affect and ensure survival. To me, those are really, really great questions. And for me particularly, I know that I've been set up to really not consider Hagar, like in Sunday school lessons. It's all about Abraham, it's all about Sarah, and to miss this richness and to try to get my head around, well, what if you really most, and not all Black women do, but what if you really do most identify with Hagar in the story? Where is God for you? And what's theology like for you? And how does the church need to respond to you instead of the way it's responding now? Those to me seem like the really big pulse points that I wish other people we were thinking through together.
I'd also like to see a whole lot more of what Darlene is doing, because I think there are many women who live in dangerous or isolating or painful circumstances that don't have the resources to find a way out,
right,
to find the liberation. And so they live in slavery.
Yeah.
And the choice is slavery or death.
Yes.
So I'd like for us as a culture to find a way to do more of that work and to be more aware of the need.
Yeah, I think you put, like, anytime we find ourselves, I mean, for me anyway, anytime I find myself thinking like, why do you stay with that person? My next question needs to be, how am I helping you have the ability to go somewhere else? because otherwise just saying that to somebody is just further abuse, quite honestly.
Darlene, do you have any connection with Turning Point, or do you work with them?
I don't work directly with them. I have supervised and currently supervise an intern who is working with them.
Okay.
With another church, I have done some interfacing with them, but I do not have any connection, no direct connection.
Okay.
My work is with individuals mostly, or training people to work with individuals within that system.
We, in the past, we have volunteered and given the kinds of things they request for the rest of you that are in the room. Do you know what Turning Point is and where it is?
When you Bay Area Turning Point helps women who are in domestic violence situations.
Yes.
We've supported them as a church before in some different collections as well.
Okay.
And one of the things that I want to point out that is really valuable for organizations like that is not only do they provide shelter and safety during that escape period, there is what we call community development, developing educationally, socially, emotionally, skills for managing themselves and their family, developing their ability to survive, not just survive, but to thrive. Right. Once they move from that sheltered setting into, some of them have like a halfway house situation, or set them up in apartments. So there is a developmental part of that. They're not just grasping them out of the crisis and then throwing them into the wilderness again.
Right.
Yes.
It's that development piece of rehabilitation.
Yes. Thank you very much for expanding on that, Darlene, because it's important.
Susan.
Isn't there another shelter like in the port called the Bridge?
Yes. Bridge over troubled waters. Yes.
Yeah, if I'm really honest, and all this takes for us to do things like this is the only thing they make more of every day, right? It just takes money. But we have 4 acres of property we do nothing with, nothing. And I'm flirting with what we can do with it. And man, I wish we had some townhomes that we could give to women in domestic violence situations so that they could have stability. And I wish we had a business that those women could work at so that they could have a reasonable income, whether that's the thrift shop. We may have to do that anyway because our volunteers are aging out, or that's a coffee shop, or that's a cleaning service. We're going to talk about that some more this summer if you read this book, Charity Detox, with me, about how we can stop giving stuff away and start like creating meaningful economies of change, even at micro levels. But we have this property, we do. And if whatever we can do with our property to affect structures of change seems really, really important to me.
And I'd like to just throw in the book that you're talking about in the study just says over and over, giveaways hurt people.
Yeah.
We have to provide the development component of it, the development of that person or the economy to support that person is so important. Just giveaways, just giving them a place to live is not going to help unless we provide the development part to it.
Mike, somewhere downtown on the east side in a Hispanic church, they have a set of condos or apartments that they allow women to come in who have escaped from their house.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the name of it, but I can I'll find it out if you're interested.
Thank you. I mean, sadly, we're so far removed that when most people escape, they may not have vehicular transportation. And we do have some, I'd be grateful to hear, Tim, I would, because sometimes the geographic distance is really helpful when you're fleeing a situation of domestic violence. Yeah, absolutely. Getting people there is really, really tough. I'm going to put one thought in the chat that maybe could be our closing thought today, and it's okay if you disagree with it. But the most recent studies that I've heard are that Black women and white women in general earn 90% of a white man. Black women earn 60%. You feel free to say, I don't believe that's true, but what if you did?
I've seen that before, and I think it's true. Yes.
And you know, think about when you come to church, if that's your experience, what is the church saying to you about God? I am so glad you're reading this book with me. And just a reminder, next week, we're going to read chapters 2 and 3. I'm forecasting in advance that in 2 weeks, I'm going to be on vacation, like real vacation. So we are not meeting. That will give you more time to sink in, or to catch up if you want to, or to read ahead. I want to say one last thing about the book. I read this not in my global feminism class. I read this in a class called Contemporary Theologies of the Cross. And we read the entire book so that we could get to the end where she talks about Black women's suffering and how that relates to theologies of the cross that are life-giving and life-taking. And I was 21 years old when I read this book. And when I read it, I thought like, oh, that's neat, but it's a niche experience. And now that I'm reading it again, I realize that it is a unique experience that beckons and offers to transform the limited way I look at the text and to expand what faithfulness and discipleship look like as a Black woman and as a white man. So I hope this will enlarge your resonance with the whole of Scripture and theology. And I will see you next week for chapters 2 and 3. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
As always, if you have questions or comments, throw them to me early. Julia already did that, and that's why we talked about names for God up front. I'm happy to make all kinds of nonsensical documents if they're helpful for you. Just ask, and I'll go to work. See you soon.
Okay. Y'all have a good week.
Thanks, you too.